Actually, I'd like to start this out by asking a question of the room. Could you raise your hand if you're from the United States of America? Yeah, okay. Actually, that's a smaller number than I expected, even here in Berlin. Okay, leave your hands up for a second. Now I want you to get out your phones, and if you're from the United States of America, go to savecrypto.org. We're running a campaign. The group I'm working with, the I2 Coalition, which is a trade association for the people that build the infrastructure of the internet. We're running a campaign to stop backdoors on encryption. And I want you to go to savecrypto.org, and I want you to sign the petition to stop backdoors on encryption. It's one of the things we get to talk about today. So the other reason why I asked how many people were from the United States of America is that when you're from the USA, you, I think, listen with different ears when it comes to topics like the ones we're going to discuss today about decentralized power online and about issues regarding privacy and security, because our government was an instigator with a lot of the things that came out about the Snowden revelations. And the conversation has, in a way, the tone of the conversation has been set by the reactions that have occurred in the wake of those revelations. So what I'd like to do is basically talk to you guys, start a conversation about what we see right now as the threats to the openness of the internet today. What are the major threats that we see out there right now? And this is just a general conversation.
Well, maybe I picked this up from my own keynote this morning.
That's good.
I guess you all been there. Who hasn't listened to my keynote this morning? Leave the room, right? Oh, you leave the room. No, just kidding. I mean, there is so many things that threaten the openness of the internet. And you may ask, why is that important at all, right? There's lots of stuff that is not open that is great. But I think the point is that this openness has led to a lot of innovation that made the world a better place. So losing that will also lose that level or destroy that innovation that we've all seen. Right? I mean, WikiLeaks itself is a good example, I guess, right? Because that's a platform that we can use anonymously to leak stuff, but also to publish things. You know, Wikipedia is a great example of that open innovation that happened where everybody participated and nobody took ownership. Right? A lot of these networking things were sort of confused with Wikipedia because companies took ownership when you publish stuff, and that's why we have Facebook and things like that. And they're taking away that freedom. Of course, creating backdoors and encryption does that too. Right? Of course, ignoring laws in individual countries and patching it up with a safe harbor agreement destroys that level of innovation because we're not solving the hard problems, right? We're just patching it and hope it's all good. So I think we should all be just personally interested in keeping it open because we benefit so much from it, on the one hand. On the other hand, we're all part of this industry, so we should sort of work on keeping it open because it's probably our duty, right? Because we are the experts, or at least we think we are, right? And so I would suggest that we all spend our lives, right, keeping this great thing rolling along, right? Because it is almost an expression of the liberties that we fought for 10,000 years, right? And we're losing them step by step, and we're not even complaining about it. Right? And because it's not so visible, right? It happens on the internet and you don't see it. It's somewhere back there on the servers at Google, it's some underwater cables that the NSA hacks. So it's not so visible, so we don't react to it.
I think that since we're at the Open-Xchange, obviously the open topic is salient, but since the dawn of innovation, which in humankind was fire on demand, we've had this paradox where we gain a capability and we immediately, the first thing we do is we exploit it. So when fire was created on demand, the first thing that anyone did was burn themselves, then burn their friends, then burn their caves, then they'd burn everything else. And gradually over the years, over tens of thousands of years, fire on demand has become radiators and small kind of containable things. And I believe that one of the challenges that we have now is that we are at an original fire-on-demand step of this journey. And so there is gross abuse, capitalist abuse of information and data and people, ultimately. And there is also some good, the good guys, good girls, who are doing things that are more democratic. And I think that that's just the same as fire on demand starting, and then people trying to harness that fire and for their own purposes. And so the meta question is, who essentially is guarding the guards, and what are the forces that are actually driving capitalist agenda, which removes democracy? You can have as open an internet as you like, or as open technology, or as open software as you like, but ultimately it's the objective of the people who are in control of the information that actually guides the outcome, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, and I think that it's touched on what I would believe is the core of the issue with the internet, in that it's essentially become yet another tool for a growing US global dominant state. And they are using, I mean, if you think about it, any intelligence agency would want to surveil. How is it that the NSA is able to do it so well? Well, yes, of course, they're pouring a lot of money into it, but actually, if you think about it, how many cables are going through the US? I mean, it's only, for so long, all of Latin American internet traffic was going through the US, so they can surveil it. The internet was devised and actually works towards being decentralized, but the people that are partaking in it at the moment are essentially allowing the US to centralize it more and more. English is the dominant language. Poorer countries can only get on to US websites, for example, Facebook Zero. So we're allowing a centralization of power of a very important tool for democracy to be in a country that is clearly, and we can see it in their the way they are in other things like TPP trade agreements, how they're trying to dominate, and they're just bringing the internet as one of the tools into that, and this centralization is taking away the democracy that the internet was built for.
What I can say from the lawyer side in France, they used to have a specific law in Europe. So when there are researches, the magistrates must give some justification before starting, and there must be the barrister on site. It was easy to apply this rule as long as the data are inside the law firm. But now the data is not located somewhere. It is in the cloud. So we have to face that issue too, how we can protect the professional secrecy with a new, with this technology.
So to me, we've got, yes, and obviously we are at the we still are in fairly early stages. People have been using the phrase Wild West to describe, I think, what you're talking about for quite some time. One of the things that I'd like to talk about is to contextualize what you were saying about safe harbor, is perhaps delve a little bit into safe harbor and talk about the changes that need to happen, the kind of ways that laws do need to evolve in order to address the changing privacy landscape jurisdictionally between different countries. And what I'd like to submit in a way to comment on the astute comments that you were making about U.S. hegemony is that one of the things we need to deal with as we're addressing privacy erosions that have happened as a result of surveillance is to acknowledge that surveillance is not just a U.S. issue, but it is a global issue, and that there are every country is doing it. Most countries, not every country is doing it, but lots of countries are doing it, and lots of countries that may not be doing it may want to do it, and something that needs to be addressed.
See, the thing is, it's certainly not geographically biased. I think the surveillance is greed-based. So it's irrelevant of race and geographic location, and the horror stories that we can see from things that are happening from China to the Czech Republic to Colombia to wherever is actually based on largely capitalistic greed, which, if you look at the genesis of that, ontologically we're talking around control. And so to challenge that through laws and regulations and whatever will not necessarily address the actual root problems, and the root problems are in human greed and the demand for control to enable a mediocre, stable society that doesn't question too much. And that's actually the problem. And I don't think that there's maybe too much disagreement about the fact that whatever laws or restrictions or regulations are changed, ultimately we should be addressing the root core, because otherwise it's window dressing, it's fluff. It's the same as saying a company is disruptive or decentralized or citizen-centric. If ultimately the greed is underneath that, then the rest of it is a PR exercise, without being too bleak. I'm a motivational speaker.
So you're saying that the core isn't the protection of mankind?
I think the core behind all of the things that we've said, to not use any generalizations, is absolute capitalist greed.
Well, one of my
It's a minor point, just to end up the conference.
this actually reminds me of one of my very favorite political cartoons of all time. It's a box that says internet regulation, and there are two wrapping papers up above, and it says, and the person is saying, which do you want this wrapped in? And it says child endangerment on one of the wrapping paper rolls, and it says terrorism on the other.
Yeah, I mean, that's even bleaker than what I said, but yeah, that's good.
Well, I guess playing with fears is always a great way of convincing people from things that they really shouldn't want. So we're being explained that backdoors and encryption are good for us because they protect us from the terrorists or child molestation or both, I don't know, right? So creating fear is part of the equation. So it's greed on the one hand, greed from people trying to gain more control in their roles and making themselves more important, and entrenching the position that they're in so that they become undisposable. Right? That is one thing that drives that, and any organization is that way. Any organization tries to make themselves, harder to get away with. So they make themselves more stable, more concrete. They want to grow more. They want to become more, no matter what it is. And governments are just the same. Right? But we have been warned about this by very smart people, right? That we shouldn't give government too much power over us. And of course, that has to get adopted, as technology evolves. The East German Stasi had laughable technology when you look at it from today. It was still kind of threatening, and that was the high tech of the day in the day. But, now we have this invisible, great technology that makes mass surveillance so much cheaper and efficient, and possible at a much greater scale. And it is being used to entrench the own position of the governments. So, governments should be for the people, right? But governments are much more for governments, and companies are much more for companies after a while as they become organizations. That's the greed thing, right? You make sure that you do well yourself, right? And
there's only two roles of government. One is to get into power, the other is to stay in power.
Yeah, and they need us like every 4 years when you're in a democracy, and not if you're not, right?
We shouldn't kid ourselves any other way than that.
No, we shouldn't be kidding ourselves. And also we shouldn't be, and you made that point, Christian, that the secret agencies, are no different, right? They are not. Some of them envy the NSA because a lot of the technology, like Sarah said, comes from the US. A lot of the cables run through the US, and if they're not running through the US, they run through England, right? And we know that
and they're all made by China.
Yeah, China is getting pretty good. So I think that's really what's going on. So they're just a little more, not as good as the guys, but they would want to be.
Just to build off of that, one of my favorite all-time quote from a movie comes from Touch of Evil. There is bad stuff that happens on the internet. Now, that's not from Touch of Evil, because that's, of course, the internet wasn't created then. A lot of bad stuff happens on the internet, but I always think of this quote whenever they talk about the needs of law enforcement. In this particular movie, a law enforcement agent is talking and saying, why does it need to be so hard? Why do I need to go through this hoop to jump through and that hoop to jump through in order to do this? And the person who is played by Charlton Heston, he's a Mexican police officer. Charlton Heston plays a Mexican police officer in this movie, and says, because police work is only easy in a police state.
That's one for the lawyer, right?
Yeah, right.
I'm not a lawyer.
Okay. So my question is this: knowing that there's bad stuff that happens on the internet, what's our responsibility to help keep bad stuff from happening on the internet? What's our responsibility?
The responsibility of lawyers?
No, the responsibility of the people that build the internet, which fill this room. People that build the internet fill this room. What's their responsibility?
It's very difficult to answer what is the responsibility on the internet. This is a question. But the responsibility of the person who uses the internet is real. But maybe for lawyers, for example, they know that it is very important to protect their professional secrecy, but they don't want maybe to change the way they use the internet at the same time.
I guess the reason that... Sorry.
And for a lawyer, it is an obligation when a lawyer talks on behalf of his clients, he must make sure that he can protect what the client say to him, and it is important that he protects the communication about the case. And most of them forget that rule, and it is a real danger for lawyers, generally in France and I think in other countries.
I want to hear what Sarah thinks about this. What would you say to every single person in this room as their responsibility as a company that's working in this space?
I think my ideal endpoint would be a kind of much longer journey. So I suppose a more immediate answer that I would like every company that deals with my data and internet usage is to at least be honest about how much you are giving away, are forced to give up. I would prefer to know sooner than 3 years after all of my emails have been given to the US government. If anybody has any information about this sort of thing, let me know. So that would be my immediate one is, I suppose, the initial rebuilding of trust between the user and the providers. And you guys are in one of the most difficult positions in this, but sadly, that's on you.
I concur. I mean, at the end of the day, there's my dad gave me a great piece of career advice when I was 14, 15 years old, and it was just one sentence. And he said, "Be honest, do good shit."
I love that.
And
that's great.
And you know what? That would be my advice to everyone in this room. And the key point in terms of the honesty and the good is that I really genuinely believe that there is a greater fortune by doing good than there is bad. I think there's a short-term win of bad, but ultimately what you end up with is a society that lacks even more trust, therefore buys fewer services, therefore funds fewer businesses, that therefore fund fewer governments. But if you actually take it from the flip side, reversal, I think there's a huge competitive advantage for being honest and doing good shit. The problem is, it's nuanced because it is in conflict to multiple agenda. Shareholder value, for instance. If you're totally honest about what you're doing with data, it's very hard to convince an analyst on Wall Street that that's going to be good for the stock price. Certainly none of the social media networks that we know of today would benefit from that type of disclosure. So, which is why I'm talking about addressing the root cause as opposed to handling the window dressing. It is pointless to handle the window dressing unless we handle the root cause. And it's great that Raf and the team at Open-Xchange are doing what they're doing, on top of which we need to address human greed.
We do have a lot of companies in this space, though, that are doing really cool stuff when it comes to transparency and when it comes to encryption, trying to build tools that make it easier. Open-Xchange is a shining example of that. I do feel as though this industry, in parts, a lot of it is the small to medium businesses, are working to try and overcome the the consumer confidence hits that it took, it has been taking for a number of years on not just surveillance issues, but also security issues. But, you know, it's a lot of small businesses that are trying. It's not necessarily everybody.
You know, I think the thing is regaining trust is a meme that we're using here. You know, maybe a way to approach it is not requiring trust by creating incredible transparency.
That's correct. 100% correct.
Right? So, I mean, why would you want to trust me? I mean, I may be a nice guy. I'm paying for the beer and all the sponsors are, and that's great. But what do you know, right? What do you know who I am? You don't know. I mean, I'm fine, I can promise you, right? But still,
I hope so.
I hope so too. But I may change tomorrow. You know, something happens in my brain, or somebody gives me this island in Hawaii that I was mentioning this morning. Right? You don't know. So the only way to create that level of trust is not requiring it. So having transparency. Right? And that's another discussion we're having about things like TTIP, and that's why WikiLeaks exists, right? I mean, really, isn't it? I mean, you're creating a level of transparency that we didn't have. I mean, that is awesome. That's the way to deal with it.
I think it's the reason why Al Jazeera is so popular as well. You know, it's at the end of the day, WikiLeaks, Al Jazeera, things that are just as things are. It's just a fact. It doesn't become "don't be evil" type questions. So you're not in a situation where we need a PR campaign to essentially change people's opinion. If you're actually truthful to your core, if you're just showing the truth as it is, which is why blockchain underneath Bitcoin is so important. A transparent public ledger that actually shows you what the seller has, and shows you what the buyer wants, and connects the two together, doesn't actually require necessarily a level of PR mechanic around it, because you can see the currency at the other end, and you can see the product at the other end, and there's no middleman in between, which is also the reason why all the banks and all the stock exchanges are trying to experiment with it. And the reason they're trying to experiment it is to become a re-intermediary inside it for capitalist greed.
Okay. So if we're talking about capitalist greed being the center of all these
Thank you. I was trying to guide you in that direction.
Your thesis, okay? Okay. So what I was trying to do when I was thinking that we were going to be talking about privacy issues, about issues around encryption and making it easier, I was like, well, what are we going to do to fix it? If capitalist greed is the problem, what are we going to do to fix it?
That is the correct panel. Should we reset the whole thing? Get some more beers.
Whatever we decide is the problem, I want to ask, what are we going to do to fix it?
Well,
So
I've spoken enough for the moment, but what I'd like to hand over actually is to Sarah again on this one. Okay, I'm going to give it a starter for 10, and then you can go, or anyone else. My view is this. There are very few ways of changing people. Very, very few ways of changing people, because it requires the intention of the person to change as well. It's the same old adage, you can't change someone you're in a relationship with unless they want to change. A psychotherapist can't change you. You have to say that you want to change to accept the change. So we then, if you look at it on a micro level, we're talking about creating the intention of people to want to change. Rather than trying to convince people they should. Hey, you should be less capitalist. You should be less greedy. What about the human race? What about the planet? It's not going to cut it, however which way you skin it. But actually enabling people to see that there's a better version for them if they change is probably along the lines of actually changing people. You actually need to show what's called in behavioral economics a distinction bias. And you've got biases and heuristics in your head, and one of the biases that we could play with is the distinction bias. You show what they've got, this huge cash pile of billions of euros at people's expense, and then you show the alternative, which has to look better, even though it won't use the same mechanics, and that's the challenge. Because money is for where the data is, and Humby, by the way, who came up with the term data is the new oil, Humby from Dun Humby, who sold for 93 million to Tesco's. When he said that, he was saying that to justify his own business model. And we all use it still. Data is the new oil. He did it to increase the value of his own company. It's not about big data, it's about tiny little small data that's called humans. That's the reality. So we have to readdress this point from creating the intention of people to change. And I don't know what the odds are of that happening, but if we can change some and show the examples of people doing things good, that look good on the outside and on the inside, then maybe some people will change. But I would imagine that 99% of people won't change, and people aren't necessarily building the future they'd want.
Or we could just switch to AI and have...
And die in 2 days. You saw my keynote earlier, didn't you?
Yeah.
You've got 48 hours of AI. Oh yeah, let's do that.
Okay, so we fixed that major problem. Anybody else want to address how to fix capitalist greed in the world? Got that one covered? Want to move on to another one?
Yeah, that's easy. Let's talk about apps.
How do we make the internet safe again? Again.
Again, I don't think it was ever safe.
No.
So maybe
Challenge the
we
assumptions
patch
there.
it up. And
Challenge the, yeah.
What do you mean by safe?
Good question.
That's a very good question.
Because, like, some would say, well, let's, ensure there's no child pornography on it. But I would argue that that whole line of reasoning is just sort of rubbish.
And do you mean the internet or do you mean the World Wide Web? Because the child porn's in the deep anyway, so... Do you mean the internet?
I love offering open-ended questions.
Socratic.
Well, and then
Answers
being berated
that-
by a really gobby panel.
I love it. No, it's fantastic.
Excuse me?
Because
No, I wasn't referring to you at all. No, you're just really quiet and subtle.
I told you it was going to be hard to shut him up, right? Now you know.
purposefully unclear because it's a complex question.
Anyway, so sorry, what was your question?
Purposefully unclear because it is a complex issue. Because everybody means something different when they say, well, I want to make things safer. I want to make things safer so that my credit card data doesn't get stolen in transfer. I want to make it safer for kids on the internet. Everybody's got a different interpretation. Really, my big question is how you deal with the morass of different interests all around the internet.
I mean, I think the first sort of step in that issue is understanding and educating people that the internet is like another tool and thing in our society, in the same way that cars and roads came in. And that we have to treat, even though it's sort of this mystical, technical thing that Joe Bloggs doesn't really understand, we don't necessarily need a whole new set of laws. I mean, if we were only going to do things that were 100% safe, none of us are going to go home tonight, never get in a car again, don't cross the road, you can't fly back to where you come from. I mean, there's issues all over, but we've understood like where the need between people's freedom, balance of privacy comes versus security, and we've understood those in the real life. And I think that the first step is people understanding that we don't need to rewrite all of this. We have to understand that this is a new tool, understand how it works, and how we apply the standards we've already understood through that is the best way for society to work on the internet. And that isn't, I mean, a child could get kidnapped coming home from school, but we don't stop them all going to school. We've worked out that they do it with parental guidance and this and that. And so there's ways to deal with this in a fashion that is true to our society without having to suddenly go, oh my God, this terrifying, freaky thing, and so let's like close it off here and legislate it. And what we've ended up with is a large surveillance data collection tool that the powerful are in control of, when it was built for all of us to be in control of it ourselves.
In my mind, that is a perfect answer. One of the things that I do with the organization that I work with, I2 Coalition, you can learn about it over there, is try to educate legislators on how the internet works. And oftentimes they're looking to figure out how they can solve problems, and we get to say, it's already baked in. There's already stuff that addresses these issues. We may use words like the World Wide Web or like the cloud, but it's really people who put computers in data centers. It's real people doing real things.
Yeah, I mean, if you take email, okay, of course I'm dumbing it down a bit, but in layman's terms, treat it like the Royal Mail or whatever, your mail service. Everyone would be horrified if all of a sudden the Royal Mail is going to collect all of the letters every day, make several copies, and give them in batches to the government if ever they ask. I mean, mail's protected. That's the way it is. So I think that we need to start explaining to legislators that this is just an electronic form of doing stuff that our society has done. We've communicated all the time. We don't suddenly randomly need a new set of rules. Let's keep the rights that we've always had, please, and can we just apply them online?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, when you think of it, I'm not even sure why we're getting this sort of, we all need these new rules. I have a suspicion that it is to do things to the freedoms that we have fought for and accomplished, like, for example, the mail laws that there are, that the government cannot open our mail, right? So now they're saying, yeah, but for fighting terrorism and stuff, we can do that with email. As if...
Yeah, but it's because the terrorists don't know how to write or send a letter, so it's the emails that we need to protect from them, you know?
Exactly, because a paper letter never, ever, right? Yeah.
If only that were the truth. Good fun, though. Fun comment.
Yeah, no,
I think what Sarah's saying is that, prosaically, is that ultimately these things aren't actually problems, they're paradoxes. And problems have an answer, and paradoxes don't. They have a balance. And so what we actually have here is a situation, in the same way as Fire on Demand, right at the start, is let's not try and regulate or ban too quickly. Let's work out the best behavior with this new context and new concept. And I think that this paradoxical situation is one that actually it's disingenuous to say, so what's the answer? Not that that's what you said. Because ultimately, it's what we are is raising a paradox that we need to be aware of the nuances across the spectrum of the paradox, and then try and look at how we can balance it so that we don't all end up having this being the second to last generation on Earth, which at the moment isn't far away from being a reality.
Forgive me for trying to save the world and tie it up in a little bow.
I know. It's okay. It's your job as a moderator. That's what you're supposed to do.
What I'd like to hear is from the legal perspective, though. Okay, so we're saying no, don't create all these new regulations and legislations. But I mean, do you think the lawyers agree? Don't you think they'd love that?
Yeah, let's all build life about what lawyers want. Are you mad? That's like the worst suggestion of how to make the world better.
On the panel, though, I just want to
They're only around for the next 8 years anyway, so it doesn't matter.
The way you ask the question, I think you have the answer already. But no, really, I think that the technology is taking over the law, and it may be too late to make law, national law. And personally, I would like to be a bit positive. It's a very good experience to have the internet. It has changed so many things. The way we can get new skill easily is fantastic. However, I don't think there is a solution now, but unless we take some technical, maybe habits, sane habits, for example, with encryption, it's a good way maybe to wait something better from internet.
And And I think because you brought up along with your legal point of lawyers really need to respect the promise or the obligation they have to keep the communication with their clients private. I've spoken with quite a number of lawyers that are like, oh, but my communications are privileged and legal, you know, privileged and confidential because I'm a lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. But what I find interesting is you speak to them, and if they go and visit a client in prison, they automatically understand that they're being surveilled there, and they don't want the authorities to understand, you know, what they're discussing with their clients, so they'll lower their voice, they'll write a bit on paper. But it's just that because, again, what I was saying, because it's a bit more abstract, I think that this means that then all of a sudden, because they're sending an email, they think that if that's the subject line, they're all right. Whereas when we see it around us in the real world, we know. And this is, again, I think, where we just need this initial education step to show how life online is kind of, although it's in a different form, the same social interactions apply. And lawyers, yes, do encrypt your emails, because even if it can't be produced in court, they now know that piece of information and they can find various other ways to get it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. However,
and by the way, the French lawyers will be encrypting their stuff real soon when they have deployed.
We also,
nice.
Yes. December.
That's an excellent
December.
Oops.
Yes.
So we talked about the need for education. We talked about the need for transparency. We're trying to solve real big problems here. We talked about crazy laws. I'll tell you one. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act in the United States has a provision in it that says that if an email sits on a server for more than 90 days, it's considered abandoned, and law enforcement doesn't need a warrant to get at it. Do any of you have any emails that are older than 90 days in your inbox? There you go. There you go. So a judge doesn't need a warrant. Law enforcement doesn't need a warrant to get at that. It's ridiculous. Sorry.
I just to say that if we think that that's as bad as it is, times it by 1,000 and then 1,000 more, and that's what's actually going on. So it's great. We feel comfortable. At least I'm not going to keep my emails for another 90 days. It's just it's the reason these things are written is so that the public think that that's the reality. It's not because it is the case.
Okay. So, but it illustrates a need, and the need that we discussed was to encrypt everything. But encrypting everything isn't that easy. I actually set up. I started encrypting my email just a few months ago, and you were actually the first email that I sent encrypted. And I still only do it for about 10% of my communications, and it's not that easy. How do we make it easier for everybody? I think you might have an answer.
Oh, yeah. I was actually waiting for Sarah because she said something that made me do stuff, which was making encryption, do work on things to fix stuff that I should use more words. And the thing was, first of all, there's people with different security profiles, and Sarah's is much higher than mine, which is probably higher than for most of the rest of the people. And you need super perfect encryption if you have a high security profile like Sarah does, right? And she has to take the burden of complex email encryption and managing your keys on your own devices and not giving those away and so forth and so forth. But then Sarah's security profile is fairly rare, for reasons we all know, right? And for good reasons, and it's true. But then the 99.99% of the people have a lower profile, and we should make using encryption easier for them, even if that may not be as super secure as what Sarah requires. So we were thinking very hard on how can we do that, right? And what I talked about, and I won't repeat myself, what we talked about this morning, what I talked about this morning, is what we set out to do. It's a journey. We have to get there. We have to get it out into the field, right? And we have people like Per, who's over here with mailbox.org, that deployed this stuff and give Sarah type encryption and the rest of the world encryption to everyone. So you can choose which one you want. And the one is more complex and harder to use and drives you nuts sometimes, right? And the other one is easier to use but not as secure as the one.
And you know what? In 3 years' time, we're going to find that the fact that we're talking about email encryption, a luxury that is from days gone old. The reality is we should be looking also at DNA encryption. The problem of backdoor interfaces that can suck emails out and in or whatever is a drop in an extraordinarily large ocean in comparison to what happens with our own self and the hackable self, and what happens when you can actually, without knowing, leave a hair in the back of a taxi cab and be found 3,000 miles away at the scene of a crime in terms of DNA matching. And that's something that no one seems to be speaking about, and is something that I think is a far greater importance than talking about the static context that we think we're in at the moment.
Well, DNA encryption may be very unhealthy if you do that.
And in 3 years' time, we will do this panel again and not laugh about that.
All right.
Wow.
But you can see that trajectory starting with biometric passports and
Absolutely
ID,
right.
and again, like you were saying, collect all the data, the control, the blah blah blah. That's right. I'm with you.
You're with me? Good. Well, I've got one anyway. I'm gonna create a new company called Open-Xchange. What do you think?
I guess you have to clarify a bit. You're not talking about encrypting our DNA, but because sequencing becomes so cheap, right, you can do a 100% match now because I can sequence my DNA for Snap.
The problem is that if you, due to the ability to map the human genome, if you brush your teeth and a tiny bit of your saliva is still on the toothbrush and you leave your toothbrush inside a hotel room, I actually know a company that will be able to recreate you at the scene of a crime the other side of the world within 12.5 minutes. So yeah, it's kind of like quite important and something that no one really knows about, and the press that don't write about it are funded by the same companies that don't want you to write about it, who also fund the governments that sure as hell aren't going to talk about it. So we end up in a situation where the future's actually not even coming soon. The future's already here, it's just not widely distributed. And everyone that would listen to this and go, oh, it's all spook stories, it's all out there. I did the same panel 19 years ago about how the internet and the World Wide Web would revolutionize businesses. And people were like, oh, really? You'll see, if you Google search Newsweek 1995, you'll find this amazing article of a guy called Clifford Stoll who watched me speak at a conference, and he wrote this scathing Newsweek article. And he said, oh, so the internet's going to be big for online shopping, so how come I actually have a local supermarket that does more trade than the entire internet? And that's what we're talking about. The new context is DNA security. And we can find it as surprising now, but in 6 or 7 years' time, everyone in this building with children will have that as the primary concern in your life. Mark my words, on record.
He's such a great motivational speaker.
It's all going to be fine. Okay, let's all go to Mars. It's good.
Right, let's go to Mars.
Do you book a lot of your speeches near cliffs? Is that how they sort of...
It's something like that. My management are in charge somewhere down there.
So my goal to wrap all these big concepts up with a nice little bow and solve all the world's problems just went out the window. We have not solved any of those problems, and we've created new ones, I think.
That's the art of a Socratic forum, is to actually end with more questions than answers, and I think you've succeeded.
Excellent. We are nearing.
I don't quite know what he's done, but it's okay.
We're nearing the end of our time here, but I want to hear from everybody one more time. And I'm going to ask another loose question that is open to interpretation, and it's one that I asked about specific questions before. I'm simply going to ask, and I'm going to start with you because you just brought up that stuff.
Me? I want to go last.
I was going to say, how do you fix it?
How do you fix what? So we're not talking about a problem, we're talking about a paradox here.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So you're still going back to the problem.
But we've already done this. You already asked this.
Shall I'll end the panel. Here's a great question.
No.
Raf.
Are you allowed to ask
Raf,
this?
It's fine. I've hijacked it. Raf. Question for you. Question for you, Raf. I know I'm coming to you. I'm coming to you next. Raf. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Question. Top main thing you want, if everyone in this room just remembers one thing from this panel, what do you want them to remember?
Encrypt.
Encrypt. Awesome. You next.
Wow. Okay. DNA sequencing is the future. Huge.
Okay.
That's what I wanted you to try and address for me before we go into close the question.
Encrypt, of course, but I would say educate.
Educate. So we've got encrypt, educate. What do we have over here?
I'm trying to think of other words that begin with E that are even somehow relevant.
Electoral democracy.
Well done, mate. Done. That's me.
Is that good?
Oh, wow.
And what about yours? Do you stick
need
on
an
DNA
E, you need an
sequencing?
E.
No, I'm not sticking with you.
Okay, you go for it. Okay. Actually, you know what? I'll go and then you finish up. I got one thing that I want everyone to remember. If there's just one thing that's in your heads at the end of this, is that the modern day contexts that we live in and the future contexts that we will live in are purely dependent on the actions that you take now. This is a term of consequence. I would like you to remember only that term, consequence. Everything you do is building the future. So build wisely, or there will be none. Inevitable consequence. No, that's not an E, that's an I. Oh, okay. Evitable consequence? That's not a word. You're a journalist. You should know this shit. Okay. Enviable ability to adjust consequence. Okay, you go. I'm done. Peace out.
Wow. Okay. So
With an E, Christian, with an E.
With an E.
with an E. Okay. Well, this has been an extraordinarily interesting panel.
No E.
I found it tremendously boring, but it's not your thing.
Yes, engagement is absolutely what it is we need to take away from this. Listen, everything that we're dealing with here, it's important shit, whether it's DNA sequencing, which was not on my radar before we started this at all, or the major issues that we know we need to deal with regards to everything from corporate greed to digital surveillance to the need to invent encryption. My God, it is this crazy world that we're all living in and being a part of. And as the people that are leaders in the cloud, we all have a responsibility to engage in these questions and do something about it. And so the question, I think everybody's answer led us to that. It's engage.
And then there's one more word that you can add to that, which is enjoy.
Enjoy.
Thank you.
Very nice.